thank you for coming to day 3 of our 4th annual PreDAC celebration. On behalf of the Canadian Securities Exchange, we welcome you. If you've been with us the last 2 days, we definitely appreciate it. Yesterday, we had some amazing guests, hosts, and panels. Anna Sarin interviewed Kendra Johnson, President and CEO of AME. The topic was headlined as Women in Mining, but it is intertwined with diversity, inclusion, equality, and education. A wonderful discussion that fits nicely with our Mining Over Canada canon. Following that, Fred Pletcher from Borden Ladner Gervais discussed shareholder activism. His panelists had Alan Bayless, Bill Zawada, and Matthew Zablosky, representing their firms of Longview Communications and Public Affairs, Laurel Hill Advisory, Delbrook Capital Advisors. Speaking of getting sound advice, may we suggest MNP for your auditing and accounting needs, DSA Corporate Services, Morelli Support Services, Capital Transfer Agency, Vested.ca, and OCI Groups. Make sure to look at your direct messages on the right-hand side. We are encouraging people to spark a conversation, but that convo won't start unless you accept the request. And feel free to submit questions in the chat box. Today's session is a special one. As mentioned earlier, Mining Over Canada explored our great country from east to west and north to south, trying to cover all areas of the mining industry. I had the privilege of hosting a podcast during Mining Over Canada titled Indigenous Insights Panel, Protecting Collective Interests. It was clear that we needed more of this. So fast forward, and I call today's session Indigenous Day, not for lack of creativity, but because there are so many facets that will be explored, covered, and discussed. This topic has been misrepresented or not clearly understood or defined, either in the general media or lack of research, and I fall into that category as well, from both negative and positive sides, and everything in between. We begin session 1 with Fpic and the duty to consult. Session 2 will be Indigenous perspectives on mining, and session 3 will be mining readiness, strong foundations that create opportunities beyond the mines. A special thank you goes out to MNP and their Indigenous Practices Group for their assistance in building today's lineup. We are beginning with panel 1, or session 1, a fireside chat. Please give a hearty PreDAC welcome to Tracy Campbell, principal of the Kellio Group. We may be joined later by Ron Desjardins, elder advisor of Birch Narrows, but we'll wait and see. Tracy has more than 25 years of experience assisting clients all across Canada when clarification of Canada's treaty relationship is required. She is a former partner with MNP LLP, former chief negotiator for the government of the Northwest Territories, and former consultation manager, Ministry of Environment for the government. I know. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. Really excited to be here. I'm hoping Ron can join and overcome the technical difficulties of connecting from northern Saskatchewan.
I hope so too, but you know, the show must go on, and we are going to go on. So the topic is called Fpic and the duty to consult. For our audience, either on the replay or in the audience, or in the stands, what does Fpic stand for, and what is duty to consult?
So those are two distinct topics that get confused all the time individually, and when they cross streams, particularly in mining exploration or development, it gets really confusing. And I think that confusion is comes by honestly for the Canadian public, in that the Canadian public generally doesn't learn about treaty rights in school. So you can go through your whole education time in Canadian schools and not learn about treaty rights or the treaty relationship. or Canada's history and the importance of treaty rights in that history. So I think the confusion around those two topics is understandable. But just as you said, Barrington, opportunities like this to help people understand what the duty to consult and accommodate process is, where it comes from, how you do it, and how that may not jive with the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' rights described in that document.
Now, we had a wonderful conversation. It seems like it was an intro / pre, where we just kept on talking and and let's just jump backwards a little bit as far as your experience, because you have such a very specific and defined historical experience with this topic. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
I know a lot about one tiny thing, one sliver of expertise that I've been focusing on for almost 30 years. So back in the early 90s, I decided to get a postgraduate degree and study natural resource development and the intersection with treaty rights. So back at that time, there was no duty to consult and accommodate process either defined or implemented by government regulators. So at the time, back in the early 90s, I called the topic of my study co-management of non-renewable resources with First Nations in Northeast BC. So specifically, I was looking at the Northeast BC situation. And it started my education process on my understanding of the treaty relationship, because like other Canadians, I had never learned about it in school, despite the fact that my family is signatories to Treaty 6. So treaty rights were never discussed at the dinner table or in our family, and I didn't learn about it in school. So by the time I got to and I'll say I was in my early 20s when I went to my graduate degree, and I'll maintain that lie. So when I did go to start my education, it was an eye-opening experience on Canada's treatment or lack of implementation of the treaty relationship. So I've held a succession of jobs since I graduated from the University of Calgary with a master's degree, working for both government, industry, and Indigenous nations across Canada, trying to clarify what the duty to consult and accommodate process is, and what's the best way for nations to participate in that process.
What is your relationship with the government? And I know that might be a loaded question, but
my view of the treaty relationship is not everybody's cup of tea. I have my perspective on what treaty rights are is not shared by probably most regulators in the country, either federal or provincial. And since the federal Crown and the provincial Crown are primarily tasked with trying to figure out what the negative impacts to treaty rights are and address them, my understanding of that process is not reflected in the current regulatory framework required for natural resource development.
When somebody, I guess, seeks advice or comes to you, how does that process work? I'm sure it starts with a phone call or an email, but what happens after that?
It usually starts when a nation is aware or is notified that there's natural resource development activity happening in their territory. And when I say in their territory, that means off reserve on Crown lands where they have treaty or Aboriginal rights. So they're aware that something is happening. They either want more information about what's happening or they're not supportive of what's happening. and they need professional support to figure out what to do next. The regulatory framework is very complex.
Sorry, do you mind if I cut you off? And I totally apologize, but I'm going to. When we spoke, and I was surprised to learn that what is considered Indigenous land is not the same definition as what the government would consider or does consider. Can you just define that and go back and then?
For sure.
Thanks.
There's three main hurdles for a nation in participating in a duty to consult process. The first is a lack of awareness or understanding of where rights exist, where those treaty rights exist. Most Canadians conceptualize treaty rights as happening on Indian reserves, within the boundaries of Indian reserves. But the rights to use land and resources primarily happen off reserve, on Crown land, where a nation has treaty or Aboriginal rights. So the first hurdle is getting clarity on where rights exist. The second hurdle is understanding what potential impacts happen to those rights from an activity. And the third hurdle is coming to an agreement on what accommodation or compensation is owed for those impacts. So in that first step is recognizing that treaty and Aboriginal rights for use of land and resources primarily happen off reserve on Crown land where the nation has treaty and Aboriginal rights.
There's so many areas I want to go, and I'm sorry I'm jumping all over the place.
No worries, man. No worries.
This is more for, I'm treating this like my own education when I'm hopefully our audience, who I do encourage to ask questions, raise your hand, use the chat box, all of those things, keep it friendly. As well. This is sort of a difficult one, or difficult for me a little bit, but what happens if it is deemed that there was a treaty violation or any other type of violation? What happens then, and what is the enforcement, and who's doing it?
There's a lot packed into that question, Barrington. So if a nation understands there's activity happening in a place where they have treaty or Aboriginal rights and they weren't consulted, that's one problem. Their first step is to either approach the Crown regulator who provided approval for that company to be there, and simultaneously approach the company saying, this is an area where we have treaty or Aboriginal rights, and what you're doing has a potential impact to our rights. So either of those discussions are not easy because the Crown, from their perspective, have already given approval for that company to be on. Let's take exploration activities, for example. The provincial government usually gives approval to exploration activities without triggering a duty to consult. So from the Crown's perspective, they, for the most part, think that exploration activities don't have a potential to negatively impact treaty or Aboriginal rights. So they've given approval, the company goes out with that piece of paper, with their approval, thinking they have the legal right to be there, and the nation either wasn't notified or wasn't consulted of that activity. If a government understands and agrees that that activity has potential impacts to treaty and Aboriginal rights, they will tell the company, go consult XYZ First Nation. And that starts the process for the procedural aspects of consultation between the company and the nation. So I wish it was a 15-second easy reply to what happens if a nation doesn't agree. But that's why you see protests all over the country when a nation runs into a wall about expressing their disagreement with that approval of that activity or the way a consultation process played out. Sometimes their option from their perspective is a blockade or a protest.
as I mentioned in the intro, I had the distinct pleasure of interviewing a few chiefs, and one of the I guess one of the things that struck me, I'm just going to call it the code, the honor. It's to defend their land. It is to defend the land,
Hmm.
and that is, yeah. I was just, I guess maybe I was just taken aback and I wasn't expecting it, but it was they have every right to do so, and not only not only talking about the legal right around that we live in, but the rights of that they have lived in and with for generations. And
Absolutely. That fight's been going on for 150 years. It's never stopped. It's never been interrupted, despite efforts by Canada to prevent those opinions from being expressed. It basically comes down to a lack of agreement on what treaty rights are. What does the treaty right or treaty relationship entail? The Crown has a very narrow understanding of what that is, and nations have a very broad understanding of what that is. So when those two opinions, when those two facts meet in a duty to consult process, yeah, it is it's a complicated, contentious process. It necessarily doesn't have to be. If the Crown and the proponent acknowledged and accepted that their activities, no matter how small, even exploration activities, have a potential for a negative impact to treaty or Aboriginal rights, the consultation process would go a lot smoother. But at that first hurdle, there is disagreement about where treaty rights exist, about the size and scope of the impacts themselves, and finally, what to do about those impacts if they're identified.
it sounds like it's almost better for the Indigenous group affected to discuss just with the mining or mineral exploration company. Like, can that happen? Can they just leave the government out of this, um, and just get it done as as grown-ups, I guess?
Well, unfortunately, proponents are kind of the meat in the sandwich. They're caught in the middle of those two um, uh, divergent opinions on what the treaty relationship is. So they're legally, a company does have to follow the regulatory process to secure the approvals that they need to undertake their activity. And the way the government has developed and implemented duty to consult guidelines across the provinces and in the territories um, is that the way they've done that is not accepted or supported by a lot of nations in Canada. So the company has no choice to follow the regulatory process. They do have a choice on how to develop and maintain a relationship with the nation. I would argue that starts with the acceptance that their activities have a negative impact on treaty and Aboriginal rights, and starting from that premise.
What are some of the examples of negative impact?
Cutting a tree down. Honestly, it's that basic. There was a Supreme Court decision back in 2005 that asked this exact question. There was a temporary winter road being proposed by the government itself, by the federal government, in a park, and they did not consult on putting that road in because they felt, well, it's temporary and it's just a road. It's probably a good thing to increase access, and so they didn't consult the nation who had treaty rights where the road was going to be put. And a nation litigated that decision to not consult. And the decision at the end of the day by the Supreme Court was the trigger for consultation is really, really low. It's, you know, it's virtually any disturbance, biophysical disturbance, um, resulting from a project. So cutting a tree, digging a hole, making noise, putting workers in a spot that they weren't before, putting up a sign, putting up a fence, uh, building a road. So from 2005, governments have and regulatory authorities have had to respond to that decision. Unfortunately, the way they've implemented that Supreme Court decision is uh, by unilaterally deciding that, in their mind, smaller activities don't trigger the duty to consult. And so some of those activities that the government has decided won't negatively impact rights, the nation knows it does. And that's where disagreements happen.
I want to shift gears a little bit and find out how different or various nations work with each other or against each other, um, in order to get to the same end goal. Is there, you know what, I think I know the answer, but what's that relationship like?
So the treaty and Aboriginal rights of a nation are held by that nation individually. So when a nation's Aboriginal or treaty rights are potentially impacted, then that nation has to make its own decisions about how they try to protect or prevent impacts from happening to their own rights. So I think it would be way easier for government and for industry if there was like one big chief they could talk to, like one overarching, leader that they could talk to get an answer to speak on behalf of either multiple nations or all the nations. And the way treaty rights are held, they're held by individual nations. So they don't necessarily have to agree with their neighbors, their neighboring First Nations, on their approach on how they protect their own rights. And the diversity of opinion amongst nations is huge. So there's nations who have different strategies on protecting their rights, and they don't have to look the same way as their neighbors. And even within one nation, there are differing opinions on what to do about natural resource development. And the elected leadership of that nation has to manage all those voices internally to their own nation. I mean, I live in Alberta. I participate in provincial elections. Sometimes the leaders of my provincial government don't represent my views. That's the same with First Nations and other Indigenous nations across Canada. Democracy is messy, and trying to represent your constituents is messy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Tracy. This is the point of the show where we take a little pause for a commercial break, because not only are you a wonderful guest, but I think you are an author of this book.
I am.
Tell us a little bit about an introductory guide to understanding Indigenous rights, and where one could get it.
I've been trying to explain for 30 years and coming up with a simple way to explain to an audience about treaty and Aboriginal rights, where they came from, why they have to be paid attention to, and so I've taken all of that knowledge and put it into a book. M&P. I was a partner at M&P up until the end of 2020, and M&P published this book, so you can actually get it on Amazon or directly from M&P. It's a great book to explain what the heck treaty rights are.
You know what? I wish I'm a little bit of a history buff, and I wish this book and books like this were around when I was back in school.
Me too, man. Me too.
Like, this is it's wonderful. I've had a chance to flip through it, and I suggest reaching out to Mr. or Mrs. Amazon and picking up a copy. So yeah, thank you for that. Again, for our audience members, please, we encourage you to ask questions, participate, reach out, have discussions. The only way to learn is to ask. I'm going to say a word, UNDRIP, or UNDRIP. What is it, and why are we going to talk about it?
Sure. So ever since the treaties in Canada were signed, and they've been signed anywhere from the early 1700s right up till yesterday, there has been a lack of clarity and agreement on what treaty rights are, on the size and the scope of treaty rights. And that dispute is ongoing today. Well, back in 2007, the United Nations had a committee to grapple with, well, what are the minimal standards of Indigenous rights for Indigenous peoples around the world? And this UNDRIP group worked on identifying what they understood to be the rights of Indigenous peoples, no matter where they live in the world. So that declaration, called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is UNDRIP for short, came up for approval in 2007. And the countries who had worked on drafting the declaration approved it, except for 4 companies or countries either abstained or didn't support the declaration. Those 4 countries were New Zealand, Australia, the United States, and Canada. And ironically, it's those 4 countries in the world who have the largest percentage of Indigenous populations, where Indigenous rights would be a concern. Fast forward a couple of years, Canada did eventually support and sign on to UNDRIP and supported the principles. You could argue that they were looked at as aspirational principles. But what UNDRIP did was lay out a really clear roadmap for implementing treaty rights. And it clarified what rights to education and culture and language and self-government and the right to use their nation's territories. So if you put UNDRIP, the articles of UNDRIP in a list, and you compared that to the way the duty to consult and accommodate process is implemented in Canada, they don't fit. So right now in the duty to consult and accommodate process, there is no ability for a nation to have a final say or significant input in how a natural resource decision is made in the regulatory process. UNDRIP says that nations should have free, prior, and informed consent for natural resource decisions when it affects their rights. So that part of UNDRIP is called Fpic. And you take Fpic with the consent part and the duty to consult and accommodate process with no consent, and so there's a conflict. So now Canada has taken the extraordinary step of saying they'll implement UNDRIP in federal law or make sure that federal law conforms with the principles in UNDRIP. And that's got people excited because the expectation is finally Canada will implement treaties, or the understanding of what treaties are from a nation's interpretation. But my dark heart, unfortunately, doesn't have that much optimism for implementing UNDRIP for natural resource decisions, because Canada already thinks that the new federal regulatory process implemented in 2019 already conforms with UNDRIP. And I know from personal experience, the regulatory process does not comport with Fpic or the principles in UNDRIP.
No, we talked a little bit about governments, and this is obviously going at the highest level. Does it matter party in power? Does it matter political slant somewhere on the spectrum? Is there more one in favor? Is there a political side that that your group would like to work with or has had success working with in the past?
Mm, not really. No, it doesn't matter who's in power. It doesn't matter personality or political persuasion, political party persuasion. Um, the the lack of acceptance uh, of of the spirit and intent of the treaty relationship uh, is at odds with the laws in Canada right now. So, with every new leadership that comes either provincially or federally, there's always, hope that the new uh, government leadership would change the way natural resource decisions happen, or the way healthcare is funded, or the way education is funded, or a recognition that treaty rights to education exist. There's always hope. But so far, uh, governments nibble around the edges at quite superficial things and don't deal with the reality of that disconnect between the spirit and intent of the treaty relationship and what's happening on the ground today.
Uh,
You can boil down the treaty relationship to the word share. The treaty relationship from a nation's perspective was about sharing Canada's land and resources, and that has never happened.
that's the principle number one in kindergarten. Like,
Which
um,
kindergarten did you go to?
sharing is caring. uh, Bill Bill 15. Bill 15 is in the news. Let's
Yep. So
talk to us about it.
that is the federal government initiative from their perspective, to implement UNDRIP, or
Okay.
make Canadian law compatible with the principles in UNDRIP. And uh, there's a whole bunch of problems with that bill. The objective, I think, is awesome, in that there's a recognition that the principles in UNDRIP are good things. They should be implemented. The problem is how to do it. So implementing UNDRIP through primarily delegated federal authority, and I think this is another show, Barrington, but
Oh,
implementing
let's. Hey, we're a phone call and a Zoom link away. So,
implementing UNDRIP principles through delegated federal authority is problematic. It still leaves decision making firmly under Canada's authority, and at the end of the day, the minister unilaterally makes a decision by taking into account or consideration of the views or concerns or impacts to treaty and Aboriginal rights. At the end of the day, it's the Crown's decision.
I'm gonna borrow a line from Mining Over Canada, which you could see on CSE TV, on YouTube, as well as on your local social media platforms. Um, our good friend Anna Sarin, one of her quotes that she got from one of her interviews was, "Canada does not have an innovation problem; they have um, an implementation problem."
Uh,
And your your experiences are reinforcing that. Uh, I'm going to, because this is a mining type show, and
mhm, mhm.
um, what do you want mining companies to understand?
There is no getting around the legal requirements of the regulatory process for any natural resource developer. You have to pay attention to the regulatory process, um, and there's no choice. Understanding that regulatory process and the approach by which the regulator has implemented or integrated the duty to consult and accommodate into that regulatory process is not supported generally by First Nations or Métis governments or Inuit governments across Canada. And the proof of that is protests happening. So um, recognizing and not fighting the duty to consult and accommodate process by casting a wide net of which nations to involve in figuring out what the impacts of your project are, not if there is, but what the impacts of your activities are. And then, I mean, ultimately getting industry and government's head around a financial compensation for those impacts once identified. So it's back to the three main hurdles: accepting that there's treaty and Aboriginal rights likely on the spot where you want to do something, recognizing that impacts to those rights will happen from even exploration activities, and compensating for those impacts.
You know, again, reverting back to my limited conversations with Indigenous groups and chiefs, one of the barriers or one of the hurdles that came up was one group would receive a compensation and then another group would receive a compensation, and there was a huge discrepancy, and they are right beside each other, and then that would lead to things falling apart.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I guess that's what your group is trying to bridge. Yeah, this is your time to plug. Tell us. Yeah.
Well, I mostly work and support Indigenous nations in a duty to consult and accommodate process. My skills are better suited to explaining to a nation what a regulatory process is and how their rights are come to the acceptance that Canada's land and resources, because of the treaty relationship, should be shared. That's the benefits of having natural resources in Canada. The fruits of that, the benefits of that, shared with Indigenous nations. Usually that happens kind of bilaterally between a proponent and the nation. And in my opinion, that's not fair to put that burden on proponents. The Crown has to be a party to that discussion. The Crown is responsible for accommodating impacts to rights more than the company is. But unfortunately, it's downloaded to the company to have those bilateral kind of closed door discussions that if it's not transparent, those exact situations like you're describing where there's unequal either compensation amounts are identified in an IBA, or even capacity to participate in a consultation process aren't identified equitably to nations who are potentially impacted. So understanding the difference between capacity to participate and the benefits coming out of an approved project are two different things.
Well, thank you. This was great. Hopefully our audience learned something. You know, that's the goal of some of these programs is to come in and leave smarter than you came in. And every time I speak with you, Tracy, that happens.
I learned something new on every single regulatory process that I participate in. The regulatory requirements are constantly changing. The legal decisions clarifying what treaty rights are or what a duty to consult process should look like or result in keep changing. The nation's explanation and protection of rights is, I learned something new every single time. And it's an exciting, frustrating, rewarding job to have. And duty to consult and accommodate is not going anywhere. So embracing it rather than fighting it would be my message.
And on that's the note. We will conclude this sort of fireside chat discussion. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to our guests as well. Thank you to our sponsors, the support of the Canadian Securities Exchange, MNP, OCI Groups, Morelli, DSA, Capital Transfer, and vested.ca. I've been your host, Barrington Miller, and today we have been talking with Tracy Campbell about the Fpic and the duty to consult. Stick around for session 2, Indigenous Perspectives on Mining. This was done through the help of the MNP Indigenous Practices Group. Yeah, we have a lounge feature. If
You were really good at this, Barrington. You were really
yes. It's because I got the book.
No, you're a good host. You're a really good host.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I like talking and learning. So, and I'm not afraid to admit what I don't know, and that's a lot. So I'm going to be doing this for a while. So yes, please stick around. We have a lounge feature. Tracy, we can go to the lounge after we go backstage, and
awesome.
Yeah, you can mix and mingle. And stick around. 2:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 11 a.m. Pacific Time, and somewhere in the middle is the Mountain Time. And we'll be back with session 2, all part of Indigenous Day. This will be Indigenous Perspectives on Mining. Thank you. I've been your host, Barrington Miller.